Imagine an annotated UML model of your data, and let that drive your validation logic in certain fields.
I'll be the second mouse on that one. You know, the first bird gets the worm, but the second mouse gets the cheese. So, you know, on model-driven architecture or model-driven development, I'll be the second mouse. I'll let someone else demonstrate that it works. Anyone else? Yes.
I think that you presented us a couple of architectural patterns in implementing security. And my question is, have you ever found a comprehensive set of security patterns that might be as influential as the design pattern being on to the object-oriented program?
There are certainly efforts along those lines. Are they as influential? I think it would be hard to be as influential as the Gang of Four patterns. But I do think that there is a lot to be said for that approach of thinking in architectural patterns. Yeah, I don't know. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Can you give a couple of examples?
You mean of patterns?
Yeah.
Well, I hesitate because I'm not sure that the correct definition or the useful definition of a security pattern has emerged yet. I mean, I've heard things like authentication be referred to as a pattern. I'm not sure that that's useful. I mean, a firewall, for example, that seems to me to be a useful pattern, or it seems to be useful to think about a firewall as or firewalling as a pattern. So I'm not quite sure how we should approach patterns in security work. Okay.
Me personally, I don't agree with several things that you said, but my question will be related to just one of them. You said that maintenance costs will go down, so from my understanding, it will be much more difficult to maintain the business logic and all those checks on the
in the database.
Yeah,
okay.
Especially if the business rules change very dynamic. So can you elaborate on that?
Okay, that's I'm very grateful for that question, actually. I think that time and time again, let me start in another way. The classic argument for putting all the business logic for putting all the enforcement of the business rules outside the database is because one day you may want to change your database. Yeah, that's a classic argument. Do you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. I have never seen this happen. Okay. Databases always, in my experience, outlive the applications. Yeah. Applications are thrown away and rewritten. Data isn't. Really, that's where your crown jewels are. And so I think that what you just said gave me one more argument for doing it this way. Because you want these business rules to persist across these application instabilities and changes.
I've been involved in several projects when actually they realized that the database schema is not very good, so they basically restructured the whole database and they imported the data in the new schema, so using the new schema. So how that would work in this case?
Well, actually, that was the assignment. The assignment was restructuring the database. Now, it's a critical database, it's a mission-critical database, and the database has to continue to live throughout the restructuring. Does that answer your question? Okay.
I think one problem that I have with the philosophy is that I'm not sure that database languages are sophisticated enough in many cases to handle some of the business logic problems that one would face. And it depends on the database too. I mean, I guess, so I think of some of the more sophisticated, like object-oriented databases that people have come up with, where there was an ability to build a more complex architecture that could handle more complex business logic. But if I have to code stored procedures on a SQL server to encode my logic, I kind of agree with the notion that it's not that maintainable, because they can be more confusing to read than Java.
Well, although in Java, at the end of the day, the operations on the data are going to be done in SQL. And so my view would be that, well, why not code those constraints in SQL? And SQL is actually a very expressive and maybe not quite ideal, but pretty good language and pretty legible language when you are doing data operations. My experience is that in the vast majority of cases, SQL statements are quite sufficient to express the constraints. And if they're not, stored procedures are enormously expressive. You can write stored procedures in...
The lack of tools for developing stored procedures properly.
Well, I mean, you can write stored procedures in Java, in COBOL, in Ruby. I mean, you can just about use any formalism, depending, of course, on your specific database. But if you have a little bit of luck, then you should find a language to your liking there.
We do have one more session in this room
okay.
today, so I think we're going to have to cut the questions short. We'll just thank Johan. Maybe you could grab him afterwards, ask him a question.